This is Mac Engel. He's a sports columnist for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He's also covered the Rangers, the Stars, the Cowboys. He's a beat writer for several years. His blog, the Big Mac blog, was named the top sports blog in Texas in 2011. And I think he came in second in that category in 2015.
I have finished in every ranking. First, second, third, and honorable mention.
Okay.
That's big.
Okay, well that's good.
Yeah.
You should have mentioned
I didn't.
that.
I failed. I'm looking at them. There's a lot of good things in there I don't have.
Yes. Well, I'll mention one more thing, and then we'll let you go. In 2014, he was named hottest local male celebrity by Fort Worth Weekly. So
It's no different than People magazine.
give it up for Mac.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm genuinely and pleasantly and humbly surprised by the turnout today. I really want to thank Jay Black, Texas Sports Hall of Fame, for inviting me, because this was not something I had really ever anticipated when I started my career in sports journalism in Texas in 1999 or 2000. And he's right, I have written 4 books. They're available out there. You can buy as many as you want. Makes a great Christmas present, Hanukkah, or anything else. But this is the book I am here to promote today, which is Pigskin Rapture, 4 Days in the Life of Texas Football. I spent 4 days, 4 consecutive days in the fall of 2015, going to 4 different games all over the great state. And I started in Houston, went to a Colts-Texans game on a Thursday night, and I spent the entire day with the photographer Ron Jenkins, whose work was absolutely spectacular for this book, going to high schools and any place else where I could find that I thought would be influenced by football in the city of Houston for one day. Whether it was Rice University, the University of Houston, and my personal favorite, when I snuck into the Astrodome. I thought I was going to get arrested, but because it's the Astrodome and it's owned by Harris County, which a lot of us here are familiar with that building, and why it hasn't been torn down is utterly beyond me. It's basically a warehouse now, but the city in the last year recently announced plans that they're actually going to renovate it. But at the time, when we were getting ready to go to the Texans game, of course the Astrodome is adjacent to the NRG Stadium now, we went and I thought, well, let's go outside. And then we got a little bit closer and I said, well, pull on that door. Well, it didn't open. And I thought, I think I can climb up there. So no one ever stopped me to say, is this a good idea? Because it wasn't. So I walked up and I pushed on the door. Sure enough, it opened. And there were 2 glass doors. And I could sort of see inside. And I remember the unmistakable orange seats there in the Astrodome. I couldn't see them because it was still really dark. And I thought, I wonder if the next doors are open. I pushed on it. Sure enough, it was open. And I walked in, and for all of us who've ever been to the Astrodome, and I only went once, I went and saw a Stephenville game when Art Briles won a state championship against Port Neches Grove. I think that was in '99. I think that might have been his last one before he left. But you walk back in and there's all these great memories that come flooding back, even if you weren't there, and it's still there. And even though it's a dump and it's a warehouse that now is basically used to house porta potties and industrial-sized dumpsters and skids, it's still right there. And I thought, you know what, if I'm a Houstonian and I've lived here my whole life, I would have a really hard time chopping down that tree, even if it was dead. Like, I remember that. I remember when I put the swing on there. I remember when I climbed it. I remember there was a tree house. I'd have a really hard time chopping it down. So I understand, even though it's an empty box and it's probably filled with asbestos by now, I can understand why they haven't chopped it down. And that was one of the highlights of the day. And what I kept finding out when I did the book, every place I went, I just kept finding more and more and more football. So even though we think, and we know our calendar every fall, especially if we're here, is affected by football and the schedule, I don't even think we are aware of it, how it has sort of seeped into our subconscious, how much our daily routine and sometimes our morale and our mood is affected by the success or the failures of our local team. So, and the next, I went to the game, and I really wanted the Texans to win. I wanted all the teams that I was covering in those 4 days, I desperately wanted them to win because I wanted better pictures. Sure enough, the Texans went out and lost, which is great. And then we got on a plane the next morning, and the publisher for whom the publisher was out of Connecticut or Maryland, and this book was his idea. I wish I could say it was mine, but it was his idea. And so then we flew out to Midland, Odessa, which was obviously the home of Friday Night Lights. And that region has changed so much since Buzz Bissinger wrote that book. And it's just not the same place anymore. Odessa Permian isn't the same place anymore. Midland isn't the same place anymore. Odessa isn't the same place anymore. And the economy has changed it. And that's probably been the biggest trigger and why the demographics have changed so dramatically. I mean, it's predominantly a Hispanic place now, quite frankly. And when you look at the team and the rosters and things like that, you see predominantly Hispanic names. And that's not apropos of anything, but we haven't seen in Texas so far is a team win a state championship with a predominantly Hispanic roster. And the other thing we haven't seen, and I couldn't believe this until I looked it up, we haven't seen West Texas win a state championship in football since Cedric Benson was there for Midland Lee. And while that rivalry is still a big deal, and the game matters a lot, and the team matters a significant amount to both respective communities, it's not quite the same. And I'm sure we've seen it here too in Waco and other places where we live. You know, teenagers are more interested in different things now. Soccer's become a big thing. We're all distracted by our phones. And just the level of passion and intensity that was made famous by that book, sometimes not in the best of light, it still exists, but not nearly to the same level of wattage and why it merited a film and a book and a TV show and maybe a Broadway show or whatever else. But it was fun to go back because I hadn't been there since I think about 2000, and they still talk about that book with a lot of disdain, justifiably so. I mean, if I lived there and the way they treated me was great. They just couldn't have been any nicer, all of them. They were so hospitable and people were wonderful and they were so trusting. So I can see why they felt burned. Here's this guy coming in from Philadelphia who tells them, hey, I really want to tell him this story about how you're this small team, little engine that could, and what he writes is, quite frankly, their dirty laundry. And that'd be pretty bad. Now, I understand, and I've interviewed Buzz, and I've talked to him a couple of times, and he's a unique cat. He's a good guy, and he's a really good writer, and I can see why he did it. But I can also see why they hate his guts. So we got in the car about 10:30 or 11 o'clock that night and drove through the night. And on the drive out back to Fort Worth, I passed the exit for Sweetwater, which was kind of fun because a number of years ago I got to go out and interview Sammy Baugh at his house. He lived in Rotan. And Sammy is arguably the most famous football player that Texas produced of the first half of the century. I can't think of anybody any more famous or any better. And Sammy was one of these guys who would say, yeah, you can come to me. I ain't going to you. And he just didn't care. So when I called out to his house, he had answered it. And I always wanted to tell that story. I was like, I'm going to get this in, even if it kills me. So I kind of determined when I wrote this book, I'm like, there's the exit. I'm going to tell this story. And it was fun to retell it because not many people got to go to Sammy Baugh's house and hang out in his house for 2 or 3 hours and listen to him tell stories when he was a much older man. That was one of the more enjoyable things in my career because it's really weird. You're sitting, I'm nobody, and I'm sitting in his living room, and he's just sitting there with a big thing of chew in his mouth and cussing like a sailor. And you wouldn't know that this was Sammy Baugh. You wouldn't know that this guy was a big deal. You wouldn't know this guy was in movies. You wouldn't know that this guy was arguably the most famous football player alive for decades, and that he was a member of Pro Football Hall of Fame's inaugural class. You would know none of it until you walk down this very narrow hallway back to, I believe, his laundry room, and there were some of his awards and his plaques. There's the only trace of it. You had no idea that this guy was a big deal. So we're walking out of the house, and he's, and John on his, I don't know if he wore dentures or not. I don't think he did. He says, you want a soda? And I said, yeah, sure. I said, what you got? He said, I got Dr. Pepper. So he reaches into his fridge, and he gives it to me. And right before he gives it to me, he shakes it up. He's doing this. He says, there you go. I'm like, thank you, sir. And he knew he was just messing with me, but I was like, that was kind of fun. But I always wanted to tell that story, and this book gave me the chance to do it. So we got in the car, and we got back at the house about 3 o'clock in the morning. And because the Texas-Oklahoma game, which was going to be an anchor of this book, was Saturday afternoon at the Cotton Bowl. That game starts at 11 a.m., which I still think is cruel and unusual punishment to anybody who's ever done it, because parking at the Cotton Bowl is horrendous during the state fair. Now add a football game to it at 11 a.m. So we got up at about 7. We ran about 3 hours of sleep on 2 straight nights. We got up and we made it. And I remember before walking in, I felt like a zombie. I was like, I have to get down on the field. Well, my press credentials didn't allow for that. I just went in anyways. And if you've ever thought a confident wave and a clipboard and a pen will get you in just about anywhere, I was living proof. I looked like a zombie, and I walked in, and the ushers couldn't have cared less. But I remember thinking, please Texas win, please Texas win. And thank God Texas went out and won. We've got these great pictures of Charlie Strong. He's going to turn it around. Texas is rolling. It's going to be great. They beat Oklahoma, his big rival, and then they went out and stunk it up, and he got fired. But for one night, for one day, he gave me the game that I needed for my book, which is in the end all I really cared about. And then that night we went to a sports bar in Fort Worth, because one of the hardest things about doing this book was we had to find games we had to eliminate. There was just no way to get it all, because I really wanted to include Kyle Field and College Station. I really wanted to include Baylor because of the visual of McLean Stadium. It's like, we got to get it. And there's no way. Baylor was playing Kansas, and they were up 100-0. So we couldn't get that one in. But what I had decided